Kia ora koutou, me mihi o te atanei. Welcome to this biodiversity strategy, Indigenous biodiversity strategy workshop. I'll open with karakia. With whom I tangia te manu nei, mā tui a. Tui a ki rong, tui a ki raro, tui a ki roko, tui a ki waho, tui tangata, ka rongo te pō, ka rongo te ao, tui uka takata, he waiki nui, he waiki ro, he waiki pamama, te hono wairu, ro paramai te toki hami e hui. And welcome Shay and Hillary. Welcome who's in there. We plug these. I should turn this on. We've got a telehead. So I think we're all set to kick off to mihi atu ki a koe Shay and Corey. And over to you to see this up. Good.
Kia ora koutou, tēnā koe I te mana whenua, tēnā koe I te kamihera, ko Shay Tokuunga. I'm Shay from the strategy team, back here for the third workshop for the Indigenous Biodiversity Strategy for Otago Regional Council. So yeah, you will all have had a chance to look at the agenda for today, so I'll just quickly skip over that. We'll do some context and then we'll get into the workshop. Just looking to see, based on the feedback from last time, whether we hit the mark and move on to next steps. Oops. Okay, so just by way of sort of a minute's worth of context, over the past 14 months, we've held 2 Environment Science and Policy Committee workshops, which you'll have been part of. We've convened 2 biodiversity strategy reference group meetings, which a few of you have been on, for councillors, to mana whenua representatives, and we've collaborated with teams across ORC. We've also held some strategy development sessions and maintained regular communication with Okaha and Te Ao Manawa, further reflecting that partnership. And we've worked closely with Otago City and District Councils and the Department of Conservation through the Otago Biodiversity Forum, so that we're really lined up with the others working in this space. And we've also been out and gathered insight from key stakeholders through north of 44 meetings with key stakeholders. So I won't belabor the point more than that. What we'll do now is just work through each of the points of feedback from the last workshop, and I'll highlight how we've responded to those in the document, before opening the floor to hear if we've hit the mark. And just a note to say thanks, Councillor Somerville, for your notes previously. I've endeavoured to cover some of those points throughout, but look forward to the discussion. Yeah, so first up, just a quick note on the intent of the document. So we've got a strategy on a page, which is in front of you here, and it's designed to be at a high level to capture it and guide the work. So we've got the high level why and then how we'll make it real. And sitting underneath that is the rest of the document, really. There's some detail and where do we want to get to and how will we get there pieces. And there's also Appendix 3, which really lays out a path from where we are now to where we want to get to, and how we can get started on that within the next couple of years with the resourcing and projects we have now on those scopes. Then the real detail comes in the implementation plan. We will work with teams, and that will help us feed into the next long-term plan with some good recommendations for you. Okay, so the first piece of what we've heard so far is around the scope of the strategy. So the first part of that is Kiu Taki Tai, including the land, freshwater and coastal marine environments. So this is woven into the long-term vision, as you will have seen, and we've also emphasised that with the principle, the Kiu Taki Tai principle of managing the environment as an interconnected system. We also heard that biosecurity, bringing biosecurity into the biodiversity strategy was part of the scope. And so we've fully integrated it into what we'll do. So each piece of that reflects what would happen in the biosecurity world as well as across biodiversity more broadly. And the real detail with some of those key pathways planning, surveillance, and other approaches from the biosecurity realm are in detail on Appendix 3. And then alignment with Te Mana Te Tau, the National Biodiversity Strategy. What we found was that our situation analysis really mirrored many of the findings from that strategy. And that's meant we've been able to reflect the approach in there and the three or strategic priorities from that directly into what we'll do on the page. You'll see it there. Te ake me te whakahau manu, whakahau and tuapapa. Those three areas. Okay, so then the elements of existing policies and strategies that should inform the vision, outcomes and approach, which we talked about last time. You'll see that on the page in the long-term vision, and what was apparent to us, as well as the outcomes, sorry, what was apparent to us was that it wasn't just about achieving good outcomes for Indigenous biodiversity, but about empowering kaitiakitanga and stewardship amongst our communities, kaitiakitanga from Mana Whenua, who hold that, and really leaning into that, our role being about empowering our communities as well. Yeah, stop there for comments.
Open for comments.
Yeah.
Could you just go, I don't know if it was forward or back slightly, there was one more bullet point at the bottom.
I'll cover that.
Finish.
If you
Oh, okay, you haven't got there yet, never mind then.
We had a session yesterday with Mana Te Mana. Particular points come from that session. Jay,
Yeah.
that could be shared at this point.
Yeah, for sure. So I think there was definitely within the Kiu-Taki-Tai or all of those realms, a point about making it clear that we are talking across all of them and maybe including some wording, particularly in that principle about, for example, the marine environment. I think that was raised. So the thinking is that that principle should actually articulate land, freshwater and coastal marine on the page. Also received some feedback about the role of Mana Whenua and it being broader than what we captured in the document around mahiki kai and tauaka species, more about a broader connection through worldview. So we'll look to include that in a way that's appropriate. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah, good. Any other comments, questions at this point? Councillor Wilson.
Just in light of the discussion we just had and understanding that this is, we've got the New Zealand strategy, the ability to be partnering wider with Environment Southland and other South Island councils in doing this work, because they're not going to be inconsistent generally in a lot of these things, and I'm just wondering if that should be coming in this point, or is that later?
That's a good point. At the beginning of this work, we were talking to our neighbouring councils, and they are looking to align to the national strategy as well. They have some work ongoing at the moment. We are already working really closely with them through the biosecurity space, so there's quite a bit to build on there. But we have included that in kind of the detail of what's on the page. Some more work in that space, especially addressing cross-boundary pieces, for example.
Yeah, well, the biodiversity piece is very critical at a South Island level, but and given where the government's going, but the idea that we have a whole lot of councils doing the same work, and I appreciate it's in the report, but I'm just wondering whether we should be looking at synergies more broadly right over the South Island. Only because and having some councils taking leads in some of these areas. Yeah. I'd be doing it on a whole lot of our projects, not just this one, but yeah. I think you've got really good, strong alliances with Southland and Ecan, but I'm not sure that we've gone further with this possibility for that.
Yeah, it's a good point, and it's certainly something we've benefited from during the development of the strategy. We went across the nation, and we've got lots of expertise from where those councils have tested things out or specialised. So yeah, I hear what you're saying. We've got a specific action about building those cross-boundary relationships. Something to.
We're just we're poor in the South Island for getting any investment from government because we're just so few in numbers. We have to combine in order to get those numbers. Otherwise, we just can't tell a rational story. We're competing against each other, and you see the great stuff happening in Wyden Pines, and you see this stuff happening in Wallabies. It's we should be building together and having a much more strategic voice.
Thanks.
It would work with iwi, I think, more easily too.
Well, there's certainly an emphasis on the biodiversity, national biodiversity strategy collaboration and working together. It's as I said yesterday, this simply will not work if we don't have good connectivity. Boundaries mean nothing in some respects, I think is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Carry on to the next. Okay, so the last time we spoke, we heard pretty clearly that the maintenance of Indigenous biodiversity is the overarching priority for the strategy. So this is the reason for the change to the working title that we're calling it in Policy Indigenous Biodiversity Strategy. And that does reflect our RMA function that we've been given. And we've also reflected that throughout strategy and the definitions that we're including for biodiversity in our role. And we also have included a principle for how we'll work, which is intended to sit underneath everything we do, just to remind us of that function and to focus on Indigenous biodiversity and prioritising its mode, which is sort of drawn straight from the National Policy Statement on Indigenous Biodiversity. And we'll just bunch these up into two points. So clarifying how ORC makes decisions when maintaining Indigenous biodiversity is at odds with community values. So in the end there's hard choices to make. So we've been really mindful to set this up to equip decision makers, which could be yourselves, leaders, staff, with the best available information across the different knowledge systems, so Western science, Mātauranga Māori, and community knowledge, so that those decisions can be really well informed and confident. Plus, we've also included approaches like co-designing with our communities, which give us the tools to get aligned or have the right conversations to get the best outcomes.
Open for comment or questions. Councillor Al,
I guess I just wanted to clarify around maintenance of Indigenous biodiversity as maintenance of existing Indigenous biodiversity rather than maintenance of overall, because those are two, and I think that's the difference that we noted in that aim 1 versus sort of aim 6, because you've got the overall biodiversity measurements of a region versus maintaining and protecting existing ecosystems where they are, which are two sort of separate but both important things. And I guess I'm just wondering, for example, could you, I don't know, cut down a patch of forest if there was a equal and opposite biodiversity enhancement elsewhere.
So I think these things are addressed quite well by the National Policy Statement, and we haven't tried to replicate that here. What we've tried to do is bring it into the kind of bring the system together, so there's the support for action, and we know where it's important to act. I think in terms of maintaining Indigenous biodiversity, yeah, I think that's about keeping what we have. You know, is that really important remnant that we can build on if that's the desire of our communities. And then in terms of going beyond that, you know, enhancing, really looking to draw on our communities' aspirations to be where that goes and be strategic about that. Yeah.
Absolutely, we'll draw that out.
So, just want to be sure, are we talking about Toot and Bush Lawyer as examples? I mean, I had an interesting conversation with Matt Ford afterwards. There are some things that I'm not quite sure, even Willie Vethia and Matagari's at the question. I just think we need to focus on possibly education about those values that are good about some of those things as well. There are some exceptions to everything, and Bush Lawyer would be mine, but Toot certainly has a huge
Something good about Toot. Is there something good about Toot?
Well, I know, but I'm sure there is. I'm sure it's in an ecosystem. There are some values, but Toot has, and he's to give me an example. He lost 3 as not with humans either, and Ben Speaker, another one. But anyway, that has got values. I just think so at the moment, and we have to really care about Matagari is having some substantial rules put on it at a central level. The suggestions that it's threatened, but in South Island it's not threatened, and so it's having some really difficult things. It's very bad on more processing more sharp spears and.
I think it makes the point that in the region we should understand what's important, right, and to achieving that role that we have. Yeah, and I know my legs in my 20s would have been grateful for the bush lawyer not existing.
Toot is a very refreshing drink, by the way, but I'm not digressing. Councillor Laws. Toot.
Thank you. I've got 2 questions. They are in relationship to the 3rd bullet point. The maintenance of Indigenous biodiversity is the overarching priority. I want to know what you mean by that. Let's just try with the first word, maintenance. Is that the right word? You are seeking to maintain the status quo?
Thank you, Councillor Laws. Yes, I mean, we are drawing directly from our function in the RMA for that. And I think that is a big ask in itself, given the pest species pressure that exists and other things like that. Yeah, and I think there's also a good definition of that provided in the National Policy Statement.
It's just not a very ambitious policy, is it?
That's
I mean,
a good point.
in fact, it's the wrong word. Maintenance. Maintenance means that you're going to keep things as they are at the moment. You're not going to improve them. Can't you use a better word? And why are you constrained by legislation when the ambition of our council is to improve Indigenous biodiversity?
So further in the strategy, it talks about maintenance and enhancement where appropriate. The point of this bullet point here was Shay could have written the maintenance and enhancement of Indigenous biodiversity. The point you were trying to get through here was that it's about the Indigenous biodiversity. That was the key point of that bullet point. But yeah,
I don't think you've understood what I've just said. I'm asking you about the word maintenance. It's clearly not the ambition of this council to maintain the status quo. And therefore, it is misleading to have that up there when our collective view is that we need to enhance biodiversity and species and their survival in our region.
Yeah, and the strategy does talk about enhancement. It's just not on this slide.
Okay, well then, why don't you change the slide? The second point is I'm struggling to also associate this if there are clear conflicts of interest or survival indeed between indigenous species and introduced species. The most obvious example is trout versus indigenous freshwater fish species up in my area. Is when that conflict occurs, what's the intent of our strategy?
Yeah, that's a good question, councillor. I think the intent is to set us up with the best information that we can have to make informed decisions and go into conversations and collaboration with people like Fish and Game, for example, knowing our stuff and being able to work through getting aligned where we can and resolving that for the benefit of that Indigenous biodiversity. We've also brought in that sort of co-design approach to deal with that, where it's really a robust discussion. And I'm also aware that we are working continually with Fish and Game, so that's a good example to raise.
Sorry, are you trying to tell me that we don't have enough information currently, after all of our research and the millions invested in it, to be able to have a conversation, to be able to set strategy? Surely we know what those threatened species are, their habitat, their environment. We've had ceaseless reports to this council for as long as I've been on it. And you're saying we need more information before we can have that strategy or that conversation?
I think, yeah, it's about applying the information and bringing it into those spaces, but there is more to understand. So the key next step is to understand what action we can take to look after those species. A good example being, where there's pest pressure, we need to know where that is, and how to respond to that with our communities.
Are you trying to tell me we don't know that?
It's true. No.
Well, yeah. So as you said, we do know quite a bit, but there is more to know, especially when it gets into at place and understanding the right approach, taking the most effective approach.
Unbelievable.
The Wildlife Act and a lot of our legislation protects exotics, manages exotics, and there's very little protect. There's no Wildlife Act does not protect Indigenous species, so it's all integrated frameworks that we're working with. But that's all I can contribute in terms of trout and exotics, and those. It's a slow turn in terms of rebuilding that connection, knowledge, information we need on Indigenous species. It's building significantly, and all of those bigger discussions are yet to be had. There are big discussions to have in the future with people with interest in exotics, but that's all I can say.
We do a small amount.
Yes.
So we hold a significant amount of information in this space, and this strategy will give us the framework to use that information to identify specific projects, and we do that at the moment with Fish and Game and landowners and iwi, but the strategy itself will not list those things. The strategy is about giving us the framework to use all the information we hold to go out and prioritise those projects which will deliver the outcomes within the strategy. So it's not a case of needing a whole lot more information. We will need some, but we hold a huge amount because of the research that's been done through the land and water plan and other functions, and we are already engaged in a number of these sorts of projects with different parties, and whether it be trout relocation or fish barriers or whatever that looks like. So this should give us a more robust framework in order to carry those conversations into other areas of the region where we're not working, because it is a little bit piecemeal at the moment, depending on where either communities or Fish and Game or other things have asked for that work to happen. So certainly in response to Michael's point, that this doesn't result in us needing a whole lot more information because we have a huge amount, but it should give us a framework to take more action and to bring those other groups that have to be involved in those conversations, because there are statutory protections over some of the game fish as well, but it will bring them to the table.
Councillor Robertson and then
Also, just with Scott Jarvie's work that he's doing in our science team, I understood that he's building up a picture of threatened species across the Otago context over time. So we've got some information, but we actually don't have a huge amount in Otago, surprisingly. So that's what we're doing. But he's also, in terms of what other people have said, I think who was he talked to him the other day was developing a system for all of New Zealand that sort of standardises how we gather that information about threatened species. So it'll be beneficial to everyone, and we will all be doing things in a consistent manner without boundaries as well. So yes, we've got information. We haven't actually got all that much detailed information in Otago, which is what our science program is working on. But Richard's totally right that on a strategic concept, let's get started with what we do know. And Michael's right as well. We do understand a whole lot about what's threatened, so let's get on with it. Yep.
Thanks. Councillor Somerville.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I've circulated some information and you've had a look at that, and perhaps now's a good time to raise some of that, because I think it does, you're asking, did we hit the mark? And a little bit of shifting is how I would have seen that. So I think my thoughts on this are around three things. I mean, there's a whole lot of good stuff in here, obviously, but three things in particular. One is perhaps a little bit of recasting of the sort of outcomes and principles, I think would bring greater clarity. What's our main outcome? Well, thriving biodiversity or maintenance and enhancement of Indigenous biodiversity. That's all good. And that's because this is our biodiversity strategy. So that's the big thing here. And I think under that, there could be some other things about good information. This number 6 here about reversing the decline would be part of that main thing. And something I would have thought specifically about biosecurity, which isn't jumping out at me in the strategy. Those other outcomes about mana whenua, supported to exercise katiaki taka and communities, that's really important that they remain there because they are aligned to our strategic directions. But the one about enhancement of biodiversity being strategic and effective, and number 5, emerging issues, seems to me those aren't useful in themselves, but they are those would better fit under those principles about how we'll work. And though it's sort of playing with wording, I think it's also brings greater clarity if we're clear about these are objectives: Indigenous biodiversity, mana whenua, communities, and then, yeah, those are the big sort of headings. So that was one thing, recasting that sort of stuff. I'll mention the others. I would have thought, from my point of view, I thought it would be helpful if there were more clearly expressed actions in here. But maybe that's because this is a strategy and that's the level that's up. So we'll keep thinking and discussing about that one. And I guess also just so that the biosecurity element of this, because it's very clear that this is combining the old or replacing the old biosecurity and biodiversity strategies, that biosecurity is not jumping out at me here at all, whereas clearly that is a very important part of our role and should be there. So happy to hear opinions and thinkings and rationales, but that's where I'm coming from now. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor. I think just to the biosecurity point, yeah, we've tried to fully integrate it so that it is just part of the same picture, but take your point that we could highlight that. So yeah, perhaps that's something we could have a look at doing. But we have, yeah, and I guess it goes to the other point around where the strategy sits in terms of the level of thinking. We've tried to capture a couple of different levels for different audiences. And so there's that on a page, which is very, very strategic, and then getting into more of the detail around, yeah, Appendix 3 as you identified. but perhaps that's, we could articulate that some more in explaining how the strategy can be used. Yeah, yeah, so highlighting that, what's in Appendix 1. Yeah, and then the final point around the outcomes, I guess, we were looking to reflect what we found in that analysis and we talked about last time. And there is some good distinctions to make between that big number one, Indigenous biodiversity maintaining resilient, and holding that decline, especially around how that relates to species, individual species, and having a focus on holding the decline of them. And yeah, we've just tried to reflect the analysis, what we found with the strategic and effective enhancement, really building on what we're doing in integrated catchment management, for example, that we want to hear the aspirations of our communities, and we brought that up to that level because that seemed quite important as it sits next to maintenance. And yes, as you've highlighted, kaitiakitaka and stewardship are key ways of achieving this, and many of the other documents sit at this outcome level as well. So that's the thinking behind.
And I'd say, I mean, just to add to that, that the kaitiakitaka and communities being empowered, they're not in there only because they're key ways of achieving this biodiversity aim. They're in there because as a council, we have identified that those are aims in themselves. There's something good in itself in those things. And that's, a different way of, that's identity. So that's why I think they should be there, not just because they're part of achieving this one, but because there's something useful in themselves. The bits that are our ways of working, we've described that there as principles, and that's really good. I like that, Kevin.
Councillor Webb.
I did have a couple of tiny comments in the appendices, but I know you've got more slides, so I'll wait to hear through that before we get to that. But just before to move on to the next slide, I just wanted to draw a line under the maintenance point that was raised earlier, because I just kind of reiterating my earlier point that the enhancement side of things and that improvement of biodiversity is covered in both on the page and the details there, and that the outcome 2 and outcome 6 and further into the document and stuff. But as you've highlighted, that outcome 1 of Indigenous biodiversity is maintaining resilient is first and foremost, because protecting what we do have is so important. It is the first and foremost thing we need to do. So before we can even think about enhancing the overall biodiversity, so that I'm very, very comfortable with the maintenance of Indigenous biodiversity as the overarching priority. So
That is the best investment after all, right? And just to, sorry, Councillor Sullivan, thanks for the feedback, and we'll take it on board and look to reflect.
Councillor Mead.
I'm not sure if this is going either. Look, in terms of the reversal of the decline of Indigenous biodiversity, why don't we include in strategies like this targets like 1,000 hectares of land annually is converted back to Indigenous Indigenous forestry? Well, it seems to me that's lacking. Why don't we have targets like that in this?
It's a good question, Tim. I think the key here is that kind of ambition needs to be led by our communities, right, and mana whenua, and so what we've set up here is the framework to do that, and we've begun to understand where our communities' ambitions are through things like catchment action plans. So that's kind of the line we've taken on that, instead of setting goals around what we want to achieve at that regional scale. Sort of it's creating a space for our communities to let us know where they want that to go, and supporting that as a function of that. Does that cover it.
There's a missing link. That's, you know, I can't put my finger on it. Yeah, we've got a great plan, good words, lots of intention. How does it actually become a physical reality, you know, and in terms of, as I see it, you know, 1,000 hectares of land becomes reforested as Indigenous. You know, if we're just expecting, once we've written all this, for that to happen, then there is something missing. So what is that step?
So a couple of points in there. So this is just a strategy, the next stage, and this talks about what we can do more or less over the next couple of years with existing resources. And over that time as well, we're going to be working with the managers of the teams who would be doing a lot of, or leading a lot of mahi in this space for ORC to work on the implementation plan, which will be into the next. A lot of that detail, a lot of like, you know, what next, what does this mean on the ground is going to come through in the implementation plan. This is the, but that implementation plan needs to be guided by a broader strategy so that we're not just doing bits and pieces all over in the absence of a broader picture of what we're trying to achieve here. We also, this is ORC strategy, so the focus here is about what ORC can, is squarely within ORC's sphere of impact and influence. So it's very much on what we can do and what we can lead and what we can empower others to do. And like Shay said, it's not us to say, well, we need 1,000 hectares covered in X, Y, and Z because we don't own that land. We can't tell exactly, you know, what to do with that. But also geographical extent of vegetation cover doesn't necessarily equate to quality and resilience of an ecosystem. So just the example I think about is, and I always talk about our bush plot when I'm sitting here talking about biodiversity, but you know, we've got a 20 hectare covenant and do a lot of pest control, and it's the understory is thriving. It is, you know, that is a really resilient little bit of bush block because we're doing heaps of pest control, we're keeping on top of possums, the understory there is there. So in the event that myrtle rust comes through and wipes out all that Kanuka, it's all right because all the broadleaves are coming up and it'll bounce back. Next door neighbour grazes deer in there. And this is the strategy is not about getting rid of the deer. I'm just saying that, you know, where you have browsing pressure in a bush block, that's not a resilient piece of bush block. So it's not just about looking at an aerial photograph and saying we've got this many hectares, therefore we've achieved, because if you've got that many hectares and it's not managed in perpetuity, it's not going to be resilient. And so you're not necessarily going to get the same biodiversity outcomes long term in the face of emerging pests and climate change than you would do maybe looking after a smaller bush block but looking after it better.
So is it for this council in its 10-year plan to establish goals like I've suggested, and through the likes of rates relief? I know it's private property and all that sort of thing, but is that where you see the action taking place with this plan?
Yeah, so the draft strategy that you've got in front of you is light in terms of the monitoring the outcomes, but it's a piece we've been working on broader outcome monitoring for the whole council. It's a project that our team is part of, and we'll be looking at all sorts of indicators for biodiversity health across the region. And yeah, outcome monitoring is about trends over time. It's not necessarily about hitting numerical targets. That's more kind of output monitoring. But if we can see that at least we're halting the decline, that everything's going in the right direction, then that would be our ambition, and that's what's articulated through this.
So the answer to your question, the answer is yes. So this will provide the strategy that should guide the decisions you make around investment and projects that will help deliver on the strategy. They will come through two ways, the implementation plan, but even the implementation plan's got to be mirrored in the long-term plan and your plan budgets. And there's different mechanisms to assist with that delivery. So direct delivery, rates relief, partnership, you know, there's a whole lot of different things, but the idea of the strategy along with the air strategy and the climate strategy and starting to get that is it should start to make that decision making simpler because you will be guided by the strategies that you're approving. But the doing piece needs to sit within long-term plans and operational implementation plans.
Yeah. Just one last question if I might. Do we have the tools that will enable us to determine whether we are making we're reversing the decline of Indigenous biodiversity? Do we have some sort of system where we can gather that information?
That's a notoriously tricky thing to do for sure, but we have a set of things that have been developed. You've seen some around the table with the threat rankings for species from Scott, as was mentioned earlier, and others. And there are a set of nationally developed indicators that are beginning to become available, and some that are in train. So we have some things that will give us some guidance at the moment, and that will continue to improve over time.
That's a yes.
Yes.
Councillor Malcolm and then McCall.
I'm just trying to go back to Councillor Sutherland. Thanks for the work you did there, but I'm just, are we saying that you're wanting, under this list that we have, are you saying you want communities are impaired and should that removed from there?
No, I'm saying those two numbers 3 and 4 outcomes should remain in there because they are part of our strategic directions.
Yeah. Good.
Thanks, Dr. But just on that one, Alan, but you're talking that the number 1 and number 6 are basically saying the same thing?
Almost, but
Almost.
they are part
Well,
of the
1, 2 and
big
6.
biodiversity outcome we're after.
I was just probably following up. I was just going to follow up a little bit on what Tim was saying. Is our strategy? Is our strategy strong enough? Saying that we want to maintain and have resilient bush or to enhance Indigenous biodiversity. Should we not have something along there that says we want to have more of it, improve it? Like, are we just happy with what we've got, or do we need to have a bigger? Is our strategy to work on? Is our strategy to have increasing areas of well-maintained biodiversity?
Yeah, and it's a good point. It is something we've tried to capture with maintain and enhance. I think enhance we would think of as that improvement.
If I see enhancing as giving the biodiversity we've got now room to breathe, as opposed to the next door neighbour's paddock, like would be like a reversion. There's lots of areas that are, there's lots of areas that are maybe in the future may be profitable to revert back into Indigenous biodiversity plant species. And it just doesn't seem to me that our strategy is encouraging or giving. We're not sitting here saying, I think we should be improving the total amount of Indigenous biodiversity, for whatever reason, rather than just be happy with what we got.
Councillor Somerville.
Just one more. Thank you. Can I just clarify then, after hearing all that discussion, I should stop complaining that there aren't sort of big actions in here because they'll be in separate implementation plans or the long-term plan. Good, I'll stop complaining.
Just teasing out the maintaining, is that because we currently are declining in biodiversity? Is that the basis of the maintain, the whole? The line, but obviously the enhancement is where we want to go. Is that what you capture?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of the role, the function that we've been given, but it is also an acknowledgement that that's a task to do that quite substantial. Yeah.
Also, I guess that what we're aiming to achieve by 2040, if we manage to halt the decline, we'd be doing blooming well, I'd say as well. And also that key principle, I agree, first of all, that we should be widening, we should be enhancing the quality as well of what we've got rather than just maintaining it. So it's what the boundary even, but within it, it needs to be higher quality, and we can do that just by enabling it to restore itself, whatever. But that principle of ecology of it's always best to protect what you've got first of all. That's the most cost effective and comes up with the best outcomes. If we manage to do that by 2040, yeah, we would be massively patting ourselves on the back when you drive around and see what's still happening. That's absolutely smashing Indigenous biodiversity still. And yeah, agree that there's a lot going on though, and promoting that enhancement is important as well, and it is there. So yeah, I think we're all agreeing.
We have tried to reflect those outcomes being attainable, particularly for staff, like, for example, and the long-term vision being a lift and being quite a bit more ambitious. Hopefully that's come through in there. Yeah, thanks.
I'll also just point out number 6 is not the decline is halted, but the decline is reversed. A reverse of a decline is an increase.
Good work, Elliot.
Sorry.
Did I hear you right now?
Councillor Moon,
I know.
Just picking up on the theme of the conversation last few minutes, and if you look at New Zealand, about 70% of the land is owned privately. The balance of the land, I think DOC have pretty much got control of the rest of it on behalf of the Crown. So I think the critical thing with the biodiversity strategy is ensuring that we empower landowners, communities, mana whenua, to help us on this journey, because we may have all these wonderful ideas that we want to enhance and maintain, but we can't do it. We can only create the environment, not the environment, but the framework to ensure that the rest of the community buy into this. And I think that's absolutely critical to ensure that we, and I know there's a consultation step to follow from once we've got a draft all ready to go out to consult with their communities, but we need to do this in collaboration with private landowners in particular, and to make it as, I don't know so much about attractive, but it's ensuring that landowners understand the opportunity, and I know a lot already understand that. Hillary's used a good example in her own situation. I've got a similar example at home. It's not perfect, but we've protected 50 odd hectares through a QE2 covenant and controlling pests, etc. But it's I suppose using examples like that to help existing landowners to understand it doesn't need to be a huge financial commitment. There's ways and means to get across the line and make considerable progress to maintain and enhance their biodiversity that we're lucky enough to have control over. So yeah, I think it's important to just understand the facts around ownership and control. It's important.
totally agree.
I'm tempted to go straight to one of the other points about that, but I'll carry on with the slides. So yeah, I guess what the other things we heard last time, working with other agencies to clarify roles and responsibilities, and particularly where there's sort of that overlap or intersection of those roles, and knowing who has the available resources or mandate at the time, and then building a clear understanding of where actions are already underway to maintain and enhance biodiversity, to identify gaps, and ensure when we get involved it's really clearly reasoned, and we can communicate that to the public. So yeah, we have overlapping roles. We can't get away from that, but this should be a strength and not a reason for there to be gaps. So the principle of kotakitanga, which sits in the principles section there, is really key to this, and sort of building up those ways of working together with those other people with roles. Mana whenua, kaitiaki, but the other agencies too. And that way we can work to our strengths and have those conversations about where the gaps are. So that coordinated leadership and collaboration sitting there on the right-hand side and getting the system right is pretty integral to that, getting around the table with leaders from those different agencies, to have these kinds of discussions. And then the next piece to this is building up that knowledge base of the biodiversity in the region where it's actually needs some help, and then being able to identify what is happening and where there's gaps, as two pieces of puzzle, is how we've tried to respond to that. So over to you. Have we hit the mark?
Oh, just one question, talking marine. Because this extends to the bottom of the ocean, so it's a bit more trickier on how that might be encouraged or enhanced, but do you want to talk about any thinking around implications there? Because it's, you know, the strategy spreads right out through to the ocean. I think we've read on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It is good to be reminded of the different realms. I think, thank you. So a couple of things, I think, Te Pāwhātawhai dock will have increasing role potentially in the region, so we're just lining that relationship up, and they would be a key part of this, but we're also in the science team, Sam Thomas is really well connected with a lot of the agencies in this space already, so we have something to build on there, and you know, he's doing some good work with them too, so I think, yeah, we're aware of this, something to build on. We've got a path forward.
You don't want to forget the poor cousin.
Absolutely.
Kia ora, Councillor Lou.
Just wondering about the ocean floor situation, and the regional council has a regulatory responsibility. I think it's 12 miles, nautical miles offshore, 22 k's, whatever. So do we need within the strategy to essentially just identify that as an area of response? I get it, mounts to the sea, mounts to the ocean floor, etc. But I suppose I'm just stating the fact we have a responsibility in that space. It's not really negotiable, I suppose. That's what I'm saying. Sorry.
No, great point. And probably part of addressing that early point too, right? But if you see it spatially, it's quite obvious, right? The lines on the map. Yeah, maybe that's something we can look into reflecting in the document. Yeah. It's a good point.
All right, any further comments? We've got a few more bullet points to work through.
Thank you. Okay, so collaborating with and empowering our communities and other organisations is key. So we heard that pretty strongly last time we had workshop, and really we've just tried to reflect that pretty solidly throughout this document, and you'll see it has more or less its own sort of focus area here with whakahau, empowering action, and many of the other things we do across this to set ourselves up to do that really well. Yeah, so have we hit the mark there? Yeah.
Silence as a yes.
Yes, no.
Sorry to jump the gun.
Love it. Yeah, so another thing we heard, I think, was clarifying the extent and the context in which we would support or enable restoration as part of the strategy, and the need to get the wording in the strategy right. So what we've done is to better reflect the intent and ambition we've heard from our communities, used that word enhance, and we've really leaned into actually understanding our community's ambition to lead us in that approach that we take. And that word enhance is kind of a good reflection of what we're talking about. I think from the point of view of, you know, we can have biodiversity that really enhances our lives without going back to a condition where humans aren't part of the mix. So hopefully that's landed okay. Have to do it, Mark.
Councillor Methven.
Just in terms of resourcing this, you know, you've got your 4 bullet points there. Do we have staff in place at the moment that can participate in these bullet points, or does it need to be resourced, or is it within our current work plan, or is it outside of it? Or yeah.
Thanks for the great question. I'd love to respond to that because I think what we found is ORC has been building strengths in some of these areas, and so there is something to build from. And with that Appendix 3, where we've laid out kind of 3 phases of build, that first phase is really building on existing resourcing work programs. So, for example, the Integrated Catchment Management Program is working in there with co-designing plans, catchment action plans with our communities. So that's a good chunk of this. Not just plans, but action beginning as well. And our catchment advisors are out there playing kind of a trusted advisor role with knowledge and capability building around biodiversity already. So there's just a couple of data points. I mean, I should be careful naming teams because it's unfair. There's lots of people wrong here.
Just make an observation. So some of you know that this is not my first time around at ORC, and I'm recycled or upcycled, I like to say. But when I was here 15 years ago, there was nobody here who had the term biodiversity in their job title, and most of us didn't even know what it meant. And as part of this exercise, we went through and looked at what work ORC does, which is related, really closely focused on Indigenous biodiversity, and built up a spreadsheet, and it's huge. So we are actually doing a lot of this work already, and like Shay said, we're really building on our strengths here. But we are doing a lot of work, and what the strategy just helps to do is help to consolidate and focus a lot of that work to make sure that we're doing the work which is most impactful in terms of maintaining and enhancing biodiversity across the region within ORC's sphere of impact and influence. So the answer is yes, we've got heaps.
And we'll be taking that time period of existing work plans to build up toward a good, well-reasoned long-term plan recommendation. Thanks. Yeah.
Councillor Weir.
Just around that final bullet point, and also the earlier bullet point around clarifying the balance, I can't remember the wording, but balancing those biodiversity priorities against if there's sort of opposing community needs, an earlier bullet point. So just on that and that bullet point, do we have an idea of what the process for clarifying sort of looks like?
Oh, I see. On that bullet, yeah. So I think really the best example is the integrated catchment management is understanding from our communities what their aspirations are, and then our piece of that we would be looking to understand from those different knowledge bases and our role. What's our piece of that puzzle? So just putting the pieces in place, I think, is probably what this is doing, rather than solving it all, because each circumstance will need that judgment.
Karen, have you got a question or comment, Karen?
Actually, it was partly about what Alan said later when, maybe I shouldn't be talking so much to ask about outcomes, but I think that when I read the strategy, I did think that there wasn't enough clarity about results, and this discussion about where the partnership with mana whenua and with community organisations, maybe that's where, that is part of a result of this strategy. So I think that when we get to that stage, I'd also apply the comment that that's where we need to clarify what we think the result will be of the partnership, as much as some of the other identifiers of either maintaining or enhancing the biodiversity.
That's a good point. We'll take that forward into the work on the outcome indicators. I think that's great advice. Okay. So recognizing the importance of mana whenua-led projects came through really strongly last time, and retaining those while upholding Mataraka Maori as our valuable knowledge system. So you'll see we've got a principle around knowledge systems, and that's really to equip us to be thinking across those. But we've addressed the mana whenua-led projects through the empowering action piece of the strategy. through identifying opportunities to partner and implement those. And this builds on multiple good examples. I think we've been working with mana whenua through, for example, the Maintaining the Gains project, and mana whenua have their own projects in Otago, out on the Taieri, Waitaki, etc. So have we met the mark?
Can I just, I'm going to pose an example. Kalupa and Underia, in the context of that being a invasive seaweed, it happens down here. I don't think it has. I think one has and one hasn't. How would you see this functioning if there was a really big, strong response required, and the funding may need to be diverted for that, because it obviously a big one. It's good tested in the coastal environment, because we don't live in the water, and therefore we don't understand those systems as much as we might an ecosystem that we see every day. And I'm just testing how you would respond to something like that.
Libby, do you want to just come and join us, because it's probably a biosecurity question.
But I know it's one that mana whenua are very
Yeah, sure. So what we would do first is talk to MPI around what kind of funding they have to support us. If there was so we do have Underia along our coastline, but we don't have Kalupa. So if there was need for a response, we would speak to them first, because they're leading the responses in the North Island at the moment. And then if there was a large response that ORC needed to take in the longer term, we would need to bring that back to council for approval, which is what our incursion response plan says. So we have a template for an incursion response if that does happen here, and then if it is a significant amount of money and is outside of what we can respond to within our existing budgets, we'd need to bring that back to council for approval and decision making.
And part of that decision making may be that we divert other funds that we do have, some from EcoFund or whatever, because of the response is so critical.
Yeah, and we would put options up around what that looks like.
Yeah. I just want to test it as a real live risk.
Yes.
In terms of lakes and riverbeds, is that a LIN's responsibility, or there's a connectivity there?
Yes, so generally it would be a LIN's responsibility, or has delegation to maintain whatever water body it is. And that can be different, but we would likely need to support them if it was an issue for our region and they weren't able to deliver what needed to be done based on budgets, or so we need to work with them, I guess, to develop a plan on who is likely to do what. But that would push up to central government in any case to figure it out. Yeah.
Councillor Wilson, then Malcolm.
Yeah. There's a real risk in all of this stuff that us being a lead body in the setting, that we become the first port of call, which isn't our responsibility. And I am nervous that there are areas, I think it's the next funding considered today, later in the day, on a DCC reserve. I mean, seriously, if we start doing that, and I expressed my concern about us doing docs work in the past, I think we need to be really clear that our role may be to facilitate coordination, but if we keep on putting ourselves out there to be the first port of call, our ratepayers will certainly be feeling it very, very quickly, and I'm really nervous about that. Coordination's fine, but if we and we can recognise everything, but if we put ourselves out there, we will be the first ones to be putting our hands in the pockets, and I'm not sure that we've got deep enough pockets. As much as I want to see it, coordinated well, I don't know that we need the answer.
And there is a decision for that. We've had a discussion similar to this one previously, and I think where we landed was at certain times it may be appropriate for us to fund or take responsibility for an action on land that would not generally be our responsibility, because it in the best interests of the region. But that is some direction that this table will need to set in terms of, we could just take a hard line and say, if it's someone else's responsibility, then we will never. Or at the moment, we do look at it in terms of broader outcomes. And if those outcomes support the direction that council has set us for the region, then we do on occasion take approach of we will fund it. But there is a balance there, so we don't just become the default. And that's guidance we'll need to keep getting from the table, because that's sort of where we are at the moment. Based, I can't remember when we had discussion, but it's come up before. And we're in that sort of, I guess I'd call it a middle ground at the moment. We're not funding everything, but we do where it makes sense. But as funding becomes less and less available, then the call on ORC to fund some of these things becomes greater. And that's the situation we're in at the moment, with much of that central government funding coming to an end.
Councillor Malcolm.
Mine, just a reinforcement of that is that there needs to be clear lines where we say we are funding it and we are not funding it, because you think of a sea incursion of a pest that possibly could be created by a log ship coming in, and then we go and fund it. Well, really, it doesn't add up to me, really. Being in a
Just
position,
enjoy the dividend.
and it's not important doing it either. But and when we sit back and look at, yes, we certainly need to be in a position where possibly we are the monitor and the strategic policy writer and the like, but funding of that sort of issue would scare me. But I hope that, a conservative middle line would be probably where I'd be sitting, but I appreciate the CEO's position. I think that's a good one, but I'd be on the conservative side. I don't think we jumped in too much when microplasma was hit. That was generally taken straight over by MPI, wasn't it? Yeah, so just be very careful of
We could have
setting precedences.
There's harvesting of undairy because it's commercially viable in areas where it grows well. I mean, there's those options as well to look at how you might convert these issues into positives. We've got a councillor, some of them.
Shay, you mentioned a moment ago, and it took me a while to think about developing outcome indicators. And it seems to me that's going to be really relevant and helpful. Where are those going to sit, and what sort of things will they likely apply to?
I think the best thing probably is that we develop those before we bring the draft to council in August, ahead. Sorry, Chair. Ahead of public feedback in August. Yeah.
We've already got a database of all the data that we can use for outcome indicators, because we're doing that for the strategic directions piece. And so it's just about identifying which of those would feed, would help us to identify what's going on in terms of implementation of the strategy.
Okay, so they will be part of the strategy, not separate.
I think we need to have some information. I think we need to have some information in the monitoring section of this around that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
The intent would be that they're across, like, part of the wider set of outcome indicators that for the strategic directions. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Mike, please, over to you, councillor.
Sorry, is that me?
Yes.
Can I talk to the bullet point that's up on the screen?
Yep.
Thank you. Do we have a list of current mana whenua-led projects and what they are?
No.
We do know a lot of them.
Yeah, we certainly have a good understanding of several, especially where they're relevant to the work that we do. But yeah, it wouldn't be an exhaustive list.
We can get that list, it's just maybe not off the top of our heads right now, but we can definitely get it.
Well, the reason why is, well, it is a bullet point and this is a workshop. And so this says, recognising the importance of manawa-led projects, number one, and retaining these. Does that mean funding these?
So what's on the screen is a reflection of what we heard at the last workshop, and what we're doing is just addressing how we've reflected that in a strategy. And so that's reflected in the strategy by identifying opportunities to partner and implementing those.
Sorry, you haven't answered my question.
It doesn't mean funding them. Again, this strategy doesn't make funding decisions. Sets the framework for which council will make independent decisions on funding, but there's nothing in the strategy that will commit us to funding.
Okay, but I haven't, well, it says retaining these. Is that the right word?
I think it is just a reflection of what we heard in the room. That was seen as important during that workshop.
Well, then you've got the wrong word. Listen, I have a real go at you over English. If you're going to recognise the importance of manawa-led projects, then those are projects that are happening outside the scope of the ORC. And then if you're going to retain them, it doesn't make any sense. So are we, and then I've just heard the chief executive say, oh, well, there's no commitment to funding any of these things. So what are the projects that you're talking about? And when you mean retain them, I'm sorry, at what role does the ORC have if they're mana whenua-led?
Can I butt in here? Michael, when the council were up in Queenstown just a month or so ago, we saw the Chronic Peak Ngaitahu project, where there's a plan to reforest, I think, 40 hectares or more of land.
Much more,
I mean, that's exactly the type of project that I think of when I see this bullet point.
But that's nothing to do with us, is it? It's Ngaitahu's project.
In terms of biodiversity the strategy, I suppose there's like a connection. I think the individual remits, they all had jobs for nature. Of course, that's gone, as has been mentioned, but they are converting those activities. It's not sure exactly what they're going to look like in another 6 months, but they do have their individual led projects with their own communities in different areas. And there's has just been mentioned, there's quite a lot of activity going up on in the Queenstown area with Manatahuna, I think it is. But there are other initiatives with, particularly, I suppose, if I want to pick on a big one, is the difficulty of fish to migrate up and get back out of the clutha, and it's just not been well, so that's a macro, and I would imagine the regional council would have an interest in how those projects might develop in terms of improving native fishery habitat and what have you, but it's not their responsibility. It's probably context principally, but I think the regional council would have an interest.
So, into your original point, I think the key thing is the use of the word retain, and I think there's a job for staff to do as far as the next steps after today's workshop, to just think about whether that is the right word to use in this circumstance, because I understand what you're saying. What does that mean, and what does that commit us to? So better articulating how the strategy reflects ORC's partnership commitment to mana whenua and the projects they have in the biodiversity space.
Yeah, I mean, good on you, Richard. I think that's spot on. The second part is Mataraka Maori, which I understand is Mataranga Maori, but for the Kaitahu dialect, as a valuable knowledge system. What does that mean, please?
So in the context of the strategy, we've looked to reflect that in how we talk about the different knowledge systems that we should be drawing on to support work and guide decision making, and that includes Western science, Whakapā Māori, and community knowledge systems. So we have the best available information to act.
Could you give an example?
It's a good point. I think that, excuse me. For example, in the Western science space, we might have some threat classifications that tell us how threatened a species is. But we might hear from Mātauranga through practice mahi kai, gathering food, that species is no longer as abundant as it was for that purpose. And so those are two really key points. And in addition to that, we might also hear from our community about how they value that species too.
So, right. That's it, is it? So the example that I've given as to Mātauranga Māori, which is as I understand, a completely different knowledge system than Western science, is about we don't have as many fish to eat there as we used to. Is that right?
That's my poor explanation. I should defer to the expert.
Look, Mātauranga is built on generations of connection to plants and their worldview that they have developed. And that's partly why the National Biodiversity Strategy was changed and broadened to be more holistic, because in the old forms of policy and strategy failed to recognise the distinct Indigenous knowledge base. And so it's broadened because it brings in the factor that science doesn't necessarily see the same in the same way. Together, they work well together, science and Mātauranga. So it's a body of knowledge. And to be fair, quite a lot of it has been lost. As we lose resources and the ability to use those resources, knowledge dissipates. And it's like the language, you can lose it in a generation and you can lose Mātauranga in a generation. It needs to be used. It needs to be exercised. And if it's part of it, a framework, and then that's an important function, I think, in a number of ways. So, look, I might have missed the number of hands here. Oh, Michael, sorry, Councillor Lewis, have you got?
No, I was just asking that question because it's a question that I will get asked by every constituent. What does that mean? What knowledge system are you talking about? What kind of information is the ORC seeking to uphold?
Yes, I understand that. And of course, people in the community will not necessarily know, because these things are re-emerging and are being engaged with and are being exercised. It's not a thing you can easily explain without that practice, and being involved. So, I mean, the National Sciences Challenge did a huge amount to try and bring that forward. It runs on a different cycle. It's not like a 1 year or 2 year, 3 year cycle to reactivate and rebuild and make that connection and draw conclusions from it. I find it's on a different cycle, and it's still building. As I've explained, a lot of that in the urbanisation of our people. So it is a legitimate body of knowledge, and it's a taonga.
Edward, thank you for that. But you can imagine, can't you, when I read the words upholding Mātauranga Māori as a valuable knowledge system, that I'm not quite sure if that means the ORC is seeking to have a strategy that funds the pursuit of that knowledge system, or it's just waiting for it to evolve. So that's why I'm asking the question.
Yes, I understand the question, and I think the Chief Executive answered that earlier on. I think the work can be looked at, but we're not asking the Regional Council to uphold our Mātauranga, no way. It's our job. It's our taonga. But, I mean, in terms of partnership and the roles that we have in terms of doing that work and applying it, yes, there is a place for it to be involved in the decision-making or the information that is gathered. So, yes, we can play with the word. Thank you. Now, I've probably forgotten who was first, but I think Malcolm, Councillor Malcolm.
Yeah, look, I think that is really important, and certainly after being involved with Puketeraki and the Toitu Te Akapupu project that was government funded, and ORC jumped in there as whether we had to take the money or whatever we did, but we worked together, we worked and drew in the community, and it's been a very valuable, I think it has been a very valuable project for the whole community and for biodiversity gains and the like. So that concept is really good, but the wording of that, now that project is and we're working on a succession plan for that project, but yeah, I am uncomfortable with that word retaining being in there, and I'm just wondering if a change to that phrase, what I would be looking for is recognising the importance of mana whenua-led projects, because I believe there has been importance in those projects, and simply putting the word "and" Matarangi Mary as a valuable knowledge system.
So just to point for clarification, and apologies for the confusion, and this is what I was trying to speak about on the first slides, is the words on the slide are not taken from the strategy. This is the words on the slide reflect what we heard from the ESP committee in the previous workshop. And so what Shay has done is just put onto the screen what he heard from the committee, and then we have taken that and tried to embed that and reflect that in the strategy in different ways. But the word retain is not used in that context in the strategy. So I would encourage the attendees today not to get too hung up on what's the specific wording on the screen, and rather more what's actually in the strategy.
That's helpful. Thanks.
Which I think Councillor Malcolm does follow through on what you said. Intent, yeah.
So, yeah, Karen.
Oh, kora anō, just in brief, to reinforce what Richard said, I read this meaning mana whenua, there's about partnership. There may be some projects we're doing that are not relevant to this strategy, but I read this strategy as being based on collaboration, not only with mana whenua, but also with communities in general, because that's where the delivery is going to occur. So I do think that Richard was just right about pointing out its partnership, and we may have other projects that are not relevant to this and that we're still doing around the environment. And I think that the point about Mataraka is that actually it's the benefit of having a different perspective that will enhance decision making. And so that's the benefit of having that present. Upholding Mataraka means that there's a benefit of going, there's more ways of thinking about this than just Western science. And as Edward rightly pointed out, it's got a scientific basis to it, although Western science doesn't often acknowledge this. But the generations of observation and deduction are very much a method that Western science would use as well. But what Mataraka has the advantage of is the period of time that it has observed and deducted over. So depth of richness to those observations. Thank you for allowing me to just repeat some comments other people have made.
Really, thanks, Karen. Councillor Wee,
it sounds like we're ready to move on anyways, but just around the council asked for a specific example of Mataraka being used in this kind of project, and I just there's quite a few in my brain. I'd be happy to share more later if you want, but touch on, for example, recently there was an example in Māori being used in conservation is growing quite a lot, and Zealandia, for example, have been using these whakawiku, the like bracken fern, and instead of using a regular net in terms of catching the toitoi and counting those for conservation of toitoi, the bullies. But even in Otago, in the East Otago Taiapuri, there's been some really cool mataraka by people that ended up being ORC staff using the maramataka to guide and learn more about power and the cycles of power in the water. And that worked better than any current scientific system that we have to understand those cycles. And so that was really helpful in terms of figuring out when was the best time to translocate those power. So those are just two really brief examples of how these knowledge systems can be used in conservation work and improving biodiversity. And this would just be making sure we're looking at that knowledge system when we do make those decisions. Happy to go on about plenty of other examples later if anyone.
Councillor Malcolm.
Yeah, look, I just going to the big sheet handed out, how we work principles, I think sums up better than that phrase, which is applying Maori Western science and community knowledge as distinct and complementary sources of knowledge. I think sums that. I should have said that earlier.
Thanks for the feedback. Okay. All right, so exploring the use of economic tools like rates relief, where they contribute to tangible biodiversity outcomes, while awaiting the outcome of central government biodiversity credit work, and supporting the adoption of innovation developed by others, encouraging innovation to address Otago's needs, as we heard across sort of investment and innovation at the last workshop. So just start with innovation. So if we have this knowledge base that we've developed and are applying to our biodiversity work, we will be better placed to guide where the innovation happens by others so that it can meet our needs, and Otago might be a good market for those innovators if they come up with something that is more efficient and effective at achieving pest control outcomes, for example. I'm sure there's many other examples. And incentives, we heard you that explore but not necessarily commit. So we've put that into the plan. We already do incentives through rates relief for open space covenants or QE2 covenants. And this is something we heard a lot across the key stakeholders actually, that this is quite important. We'll put the work in the plan, and so we can take a considered approach with all the information and facts and through those budgeting processes, rather than leap ahead to that with the strategy. And in terms of credits and offsetting, yep, we heard you. We should look to the government to lead on biodiversity credits. I believe there might be something in the work plan at the moment for that. But there is real potential for these things to contribute meaningfully to our goals if we get it right. And there's potential for us to influence how that plays out. So this could help us achieve our core responsibility maintenance, but also enhancement that our communities desire, if we can set ourselves up to be able to identify those places so that if investment is forthcoming, those things are investment ready and well informed by where our community is at, their aspirations, as well as good Western science and other yeah, if we're ready to get people to those things, that could mean we're successful in getting those. Yeah, and so we have heard quite a bit about this from key stakeholders as well. There's some of this already going on in Otago. There's some coming even outside the biodiversity credits approach. Yes, we heard about some of that yesterday at Mana, some discussion about biodiversity credits too. So did we meet the mark across these things?
Thanks, Shay. Any comment, questions, kōrero?
Okay.
Like silence is a positive, Shay.
Yeah. I'll take it out. Fantastic. And then I think probably the final piece on my slides before we get into next steps. OSC is leading innovation through the ways we collaborate with our communities. And we've tried to reflect those strengths in here and provide a bit of a pathway to keep building those and keep innovating on how we do that. Yeah, I guess there's some good examples there through that co-design approach being identified, coordination, etc. Did we meet the mark? Okay. I've won you out with all my talking. Yeah, good.
Seems so.
Right. Okay. So next steps, yeah, I guess we had a bit of conversation about some amendments that we might make to just improve how this communicates things. Particularly, I guess there's an opportunity for this forum to recommend draft to the council, which we'll be taking draft 2 on the 25th of June. We're seeking endorsement before taking the draft for public feedback.
Good. Thank you. Sure, Councillor Malcolm.
Yeah, so just going into the document that we have in page 6 of mine, which is titled Where Are We Now? And I'm just reflecting on what Dunedin was before we started building on it and the biodiversity, Indigenous biodiversity that's lost. We look at Logan Park and we look at South Dunedin. But what do you have? Just the sentence, the last sentence that you have, I just wanted 2 words to be added to it after the word streams, and that would be urban development, which is, it says at the moment, these biological threats sit alongside long-standing pressures of habitat loss, drainage of remaining wetlands, the modifications of rivers and streams for flood control, irrigation and hydroelectricity, but it's also for urban development. So, and I think it's critical that we have that in there because that's probably the type of land that they are using is probably one of the major losses of, it's the responsibility of all. So just streams for urban development, flood control, irrigation, hydroelectricity.
Good catch. Thanks.
And then because I sit at home on a small screen computer and have a standard printer, when we go, and if I particularly look at Appendix 3, it becomes very difficult for people, unless they have 3 screens and great big setups, to actually go through those. I think that's awesome, but at home, I can't get that because I've only got that, and that would be quite standard. And so the layout of that sort of stuff is, when you're generally reading on a smaller screen, it's very difficult. So I just wonder if you could format it in 2 ways. You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
I mean, this is my poor approach at trying to communicate. So we'll be getting some good advice from the communications team.
Yeah, because when I print that on A4, it all comes. You can't read it. I mean, I can't struggle, but yeah.
Yeah, the plan is that our comms team, we didn't do all the pretty design work this side of endorsement because we really want to focus on the words.
Yeah.
But the comms team are going to get hands on this in July and make it, they'll do all the design work and that's the sort of thing they pick up on as well. So yeah.
Yeah, but it's probably quite a standard way that things get presented, not just here, but by other people. And when you're actually on a home computer, it becomes,
so
unless you're a real good computer person, Elliot. We can't go around telling everyone how to fix it. But, yeah. Just a thought. Thank you.
Councillor Webb.
Just I definitely accept the point. In future, if you need to, you can zoom in on things, but I understand.
I know how to do all that. I'm just saying that there's a far better way if you hit it on all on A4s.
Yeah, I mean,
and science tells us the best way to learn it is actually print it, and I'm sure Council Laws will verify that statement.
That's perfect. Just wanted to make sure you're okay.
I know how to do it, mate. I know how to do it. I'm just looking at all my constituents.
No, absolutely. I just wanted to Potentially raise the point of perhaps, like, I think in that appendix, the what we're doing now, covers pretty much everything that we are doing, but there's some bits that feel like they're in more detail than other bits, and I don't know exactly how to, like, I feel like some of the catchment stuff is in quite good detail, and then it'll go into like one sentence that covers everything else that's happening. I don't know. I guess we don't want it to be a massive, super long document, because obviously there's areas where we're doing a whole lot of specific things. But I guess maybe it's a level of consistency in the detail that we're covering there, because there are areas where we are doing a lot, but it is just covered by a pretty small sentence. And then I also thought there should probably be mention of enviro schools in there as well, and I can't remember which
It wasn't.
focus area, but and our community and education ones could definitely mention enviro schools, because that's probably a big component in some areas that doesn't sit with us, but definitely important to recognise it there. And that's pretty much all I had to say.
Very nice, thank you.
Oh, yeah, Councillor Methven.
Get the feeling we're near the end, are we?
Yes, we are.
So just in terms of, we were talking about it before, the outcomes, and this is a very good strategy, and it's very informative and all that sort of thing. Once we get through the process of public feedback, and it becomes the document that is informing our Indigenous biodiversity, I would like to think that there will be some staff recommendations that come through to our long-term planning process in the next triennium that focus on a whole lot of the outcomes. Because there may be new people around here that haven't had anything to do with this at all. So it's really important that this comes through as a recommendation, with measurable recommendations. Yeah. Not the same with public transport and everything else.
We'll work on that.
Just picking up on Councillor Malcolm's point in Appendix 3, I think that's always a test. And Kevin raised it. I less is better in terms of if there's, I wouldn't be able to do it. I used to work with a judge who could turn that half the words on a page, no problem. Is that what the comms team are going to do? So it's because you want people to read, you have to go into it and read it.
Yeah, it'll be a balance of that Appendix 3 still serving that purpose, right, of showing the progression, but being as concise as possible and potentially being visually more approachable. I guess it's just get the text in there. And yes, it's a rather table-ish table, isn't it?
It's an art form.
Yeah,
that's all I can
it is
say
an art form.
to produce a really concise and tight document. But that's the comms team's job. I take it. Yeah, right. Good. Sure, Councillor.
Sorry, jump in and ask if we, because if this is, this is a public facing document, and so perhaps we don't want to, we don't need to list every single thing, but in terms of us at an operational level, knowing and consolidating all of those work programs explicitly, is there somewhere where we are going into that real detail and covering, every single thing we are doing in under a certain focus area? And I guess would that could that be an additional, because I just acknowledging appendices are, appendices, so I feel like they can be long if you need them to, but maybe not necessarily for this document. Just sitting somewhere, it would be good to have a big consolidation of all that work.
Yeah, excellent point. We'll be doing an implementation plan with the intent of that informing and long-term plans, etc. So maybe that's somewhere we can take some of that detail.
And that would include current work.
Yes.
Yeah, we did mentioned earlier that we went on a process of identifying all of the work across RRC that is with a focus of Indigenous biodiversity, and it's quite a long spreadsheet.
Yeah.
but we are actually looking to buddy up with Scott to try and consolidate some of those bits and pieces. And so that it will be there. And so if we're going to make that, no problem with making that publicly available and showing which of these sort of actions and outcomes the different work programs align with already. And we'll have a think about how to make that publicly available without causing confusion at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we might have come to the conclusion of the workshop. So thanks very much, Shay and Hilary, for your work, material presented, and good luck going forward. All the best, and look forward to the next iteration, I suppose, that's going to come forth into one and all councillors, Karahiatu. So I think we can close as there's no other meetings following this. We could close with Karakere. Oh, yeah, okay, so I'll just close off as we opened. So, unu here, tūru tapanui, kia mama, kia wātea, tanaka, tēnana, me te wairoa. Takatū, I roto te tinana, ngā hinengaro e o tātou nei wairoa. I ara takatū, oi koe ara e rungu I whakeire aki, kei ruka, haumi e hui e haere.
Yeah.
Good. Thanks.